And so we've had a chance to take a look at the research and get a sense of what's going on out there. So Wayne has done most of the introduction for me, so I won't go through that, but I do, as always, want to thank OMAFRA for funding this project. And I also want to take a moment and thank Michelle Doncaster, Julie Welch, and Andrew Crinklaw, all of whom have been instrumental in helping us work through it. So, okay, now it's not working. Now it's working. There we go. Just as a brief introduction, I know I've been through this a fair bit, but just a reminder that aggregate is an important industry in Ontario, and it is probably the most visible extractive resource industry in most of Ontario, and it is something that is basically across all of the space that we farm in as well. Most especially, aggregate is used in everything that we build. And because of the recent construction boom that we've seen in Ontario, it's something that we need to be reducing an awful lot more of. So it's a part of cement, concrete, asphalt, and it goes into pretty much everything. Because of the nature of aggregate, it is heavy and it is also bulky. As distance increases between point of production and point of use, material cost and therefore the cost of construction rises significantly. So we end up with the obligation to keep aggregate close to the point of use. Very much like agriculture and agricultural products. Okay, so partly this drives the reason why aggregate and agriculture are in competition. The other part being the fact that basically what produces our great agricultural land in Ontario also produced a lot of the great aggregate deposits. So for the most part, especially in Southern Ontario, we end up seeing that aggregate and agriculture are competing for the very same land base. Up to this point, the literature does show that there's an assumption that aggregate extraction affects neighboring agricultural production. But very little research has been done. Jurisdictional scans show also that legislation tends to focus not on agriculture, but on the nuisance factors of aggregate production in terms of impacts like noise and dust. But there tends not to be any actual policy that links aggregate production to effects on agriculture. The closest we see in policy is that there is the obligation, I should say, to rehabilitate. But rehabilitation policies focus on end use, and agriculture is honestly only one of many potential end uses of aggregate production. But the only really significant policy that connects aggregate and agriculture is actually against resource sterilization. Which means that any identified aggregate deposits cannot be built over until those deposits have been extracted. It serves to protect land as farmland, but once that's extracted, then, like I said, it's more about end use than it is about agriculture. So what is the project doing? Primarily, we're looking to understand the relationship between aggregate extraction and agricultural production across Ontario, and then to identify the perceived impacts aggregate extraction has on the neighboring agriculture. So the initial research questions were, what are farmers' attitudes toward local aggregate operators? So then how do farmers actually feel about having aggregate operations as their neighbors? How do farmers perceive aggregate operations to affect their farm business? So then what is it they see as actually doing? And then we're looking to find out what are the best practices that might limit the impact of aggregate production on agriculture. Now, one of the things that this does do is it assumes that aggregate production has a negative effect on agriculture. So what then could operational changes in aggregate production do to mitigate any of these negative effects? So basically, methods have been pretty straightforward. We used a survey distributed by the OFA to collect some quantitative data. And then we recruited farmers to act as volunteers to do some follow-up interviews. We did distribute a survey to some of the producers as well, recruiting or trying to recruit some of them to speak for interviews. We've also spoken with practitioners in terms of planners with municipal and ministry staff to help fill us in on some of the gaps that we've got. So we've spoken with farmers, producers, we've spoken with the OFA, we've spoken with OSGA, we've spoken with TOARC, municipal planning staff, consultants, and OMAFRA. So what we're really here about, what are we finding? The survey gave us about 239 responses, 92 of them living and farming beside active aggregate operation. It's a fairly representative sample with the bulk of them, I think it was 57% of the farms being between 100 and 400 acres. The rest of them being distributed across hundreds and up to 3,200 acres. Cash crop, livestock, mixed and specialty farms. So what I'm looking at here, okay, I'm going to go through just a little bit of the data, but what I'm looking at here, and this is something that we did expect to find, but at the same time, I think is worthwhile considering, is the fact that all farmers, so the 239 that responded saying that they live within or live near to active aggregate operation, there is not actually a very high proportion of them. As you can see, 57% of all farmers claim that there's actually no effect on their operation. As we get closer, that proportion does increase. So in the second chart on the right-hand side, what you'll see is that the numbers change by about 50%. So most of the farmers who live and farm up against aggregate operations do note some form of impact, so about 60%. But that's split amongst positive, negative, and mixed responses. Okay, so we are looking at an increased impact, but at the same time, we're not looking at really the majority of farmers who are suggesting that they have a negative impact from aggregate production. But it is, I think it's very important that we focus on the fact that there are impacts that are occurring. So the impacts that we're noticing, there are more noted as negative, but there are some pretty significant impacts that are positive as well. So I'll start, the top chart is the positive impacts. I'll start talking about those a little bit, and then I'll move on to the negative impacts. So beginning from the bottom, the most frequently noted positive impact is access to aggregate. One of the things that producers will often do is they'll provide a heavily discounted or even free aggregate to neighbors as like kind of a nuisance tax for being in the community. They've also noted that infrastructure tends to improve when aggregate is in the area. Roads become oftentimes widened, they become reinforced. Many of these, well, the roads and the infrastructure will often benefit agriculture. Local employment is available, and many aggregate companies get involved in the community as well. And this I will comment on is something that has actually earned quite a bit of praise from some of the interview respondents. Rehabilitation is mentioned as one of the positive impacts because a number of farmers do recognize that rehabilitation, or that extraction, I should say, can actually make marginal farmland better. So there is the potential that that extraction will actually benefit farmers in that way. Water at the same time can be positively benefited because, of course, changing drainage, there's the potential of changing either a high water table or raising a lower water table. Negative, however, we do come in with quite a lot more. So traffic is a huge issue. Trucking obviously being taking out the aggregate. So you've got volume being the number one. At the same time, traffic in terms of compatibility. So interference with farm equipment is something that is noted fairly frequently as well. Dust and noise get mentioned quite a lot as well. And then water can be noted as a negative impact. Blasting, quite separate from noise, is something that gets mentioned fairly frequently. And then we've got encroachment, which is not a significant issue, and then lighting and odor are also something that comes up. So one of the things that I do take note of is the fact that in the negative impacts, most of these, as was shown in the prior slide, are something that tends to be quite local. It's something that tends to be focused on like individual life and lifestyle. The positive impacts are something that tend to be much more community focused. There's an acknowledgement of the larger benefit, and that seems to be a very significant aspect of desire on part of some of the farmers, and also engagement. Let me see. Okay. So this slide is something that I find to be interesting as well. So one of the things that we did was we separated in terms of farm size and in terms of farm type. And so the top chart shows, interestingly, that the smaller the farm is, the more impact seems to be felt. So on the left-hand side, what is it? Something like 80% of the farms under 100 acres, and these are the ones that are directly adjacent, felt some form of impact. They had the highest degree of negative, which was approximately, what's the math there, about 45%. Mixed, so that's about another 25%, and then about 10% showed some form of positive impact. As you get into the mid-sized farms, so those between about 100 and 1,000 acres, you're looking at around 60% reporting impacts. And then the positive impact stays around 10%. Once you get into the larger farms, so these are over 1,000 acres, you're actually seeing that there's about even not impacted and impacted, and that the impacts actually increase significantly positive with the larger farms. Okay, so that is something in my mind that is actually fairly, I think that's significant. I think that's worth taking a look at. Now, the greater proportion of the farms, of course, are the ones between 1,000 and between, I should say, 100 and 1,000, representing, I think, about, the total was about 80%, 75 to 80% of our respondents were in that range. At the same time, farm type is a significant issue as well. And so if you take a look at the second chart, other and specialty is in the left-hand column, and they report just about 70%. So most of them indicating some sort of a negative. Now, this includes things like equine and value added, some of the things like wedding venues and agritourism. And so one of the biggest issues being, like immediate issues being things like noise, blasting, and dust. And of course, those would impact a lot of the specialty, especially the value adds, quite significantly. Livestock reported a significant amount of impacts as well, primarily being between mixed and negative. Once you get into, again, the larger farms, you're looking at a decrease, again, to about 50%. So those who are a combination of crop and livestock and those who are exclusively crop are reporting only about 50% impacts, with a relatively high proportion of mixed and positive as well. So the surveys, as a part of the, or sorry, not surveys, as a part of the surveys, we recruited interview participants. And a lot of the results were very similar to what we saw in the, a lot of the results were very similar to what we saw in the survey, with a couple of interesting exceptions. So when I did up the interview results, one of the things that I looked at was not so much the positive and negative as it was the responses. So out of 24 farmers that were interviewed, we ended up with quite a number of responses that are looking at well, I'll start from the bottom and move our way up. They're looking at conflict as being a very significant issue. 31 times conflict was mentioned in interviews with 24 farmers. Now, as the responses to aggregate were roughly split equally, about half were positive, about half were negative to the presence of aggregate, there's a very strong suggestion that conflict is actually a big issue. Water is mentioned frequently, and so that's incorporating all kinds of responses for water. So we've got quality, quantity, we've got also drainage issues that are being taken up in that 19 again. So very highly, or very well addressed or very highly focused on. Roads and traffic, again, are a very significant issue within the surveys. Rehabilitation and land loss actually shows up more in the, sorry, not in the surveys, in the interviews. Rehabilitation and land loss shows up more in the interviews than it did in the surveys. Noise, lack of oversight is something that came up in the interviews as well. And I'll talk about that a little bit. But one of the things that a lot of the farmers complained about was the fact that they had, well, no one to complain to. And this is a very significant issue in terms of being able to deal with any problems that they encounter. Policy is closely linked to that. Communication, dust is not as significantly addressed in the interviews as it is in the surveys. Economic impact, and then blast damage. One thing that came up in the interviews that I found to be very interesting myself was a separation in the attitude toward pits and quarries. Of the interviews, roughly half were beside pits, so 13, and half were beside quarries. And there was a very clear connection to overall negative attitudes toward quarries and neutral to positive attitudes toward pits. And this is something that played out pretty much regardless of where the farm was situated. The only real quarry or farmer beside a quarry that had no significant issue with the aggregate operation was someone in the near north, because it's a much more normalized industry the further north that you get. Another very interesting separation that I found amongst the interviews was the attitude arising out of the farmer's relationship with the farm itself. Out of the 24, 16 were what I'm terming as career farmers. So farmers that born on the farm, raised on the farm, and have farmed their entire life and not had a career off the farm. 8 were split between farm workout or had a full career, and generally these were professionals who had a full career off the farm and then returned to the farm following. The career farmers tended to have a much more positive attitude toward aggregate than those who had been off the farm and returned. Most especially the professionals who had been off the farm and returned had the most negative attitude toward aggregate. There was also the coincidence that of those career farmers, or sorry, of those career professionals, each of the 3 was directly against a quarry rather than a pit. So there are some interesting complicating factors that I'm finding in the relationship that that I would suggest should be followed up on in more in-depth research. So the major issues and the way that I see this working out, we should be, or the farmers, I should say, are really asking us to take a look at things like the effect on traffic and roads. Within the near north, there's a cluster of quarries where there's significant conflict between the road traffic and the local agriculture and okay, sorry, my birds are making noise. Local traffic and local agriculture. And it generally is very, very negative. Land loss is another very significant issue that farmers are talking about. One of the most important things that happens is that there are 2 things. The interim aspect, interim in the sense of, I see I'm going very long, interim in the sense of aggregate being a 25-year, oftentimes, project. At the same time, a lot of land is not returned. So rehabilitation being tied to it, but it needs to be of adequate quality. Water quantity and quality, oversight, like I've already said, being a very significant issue. Communication, again, being able to access the aggregate sites and the operators. There's a huge issue in terms of the focus on community and local, not allowing that money to leave. Capital flight was a significant issue as well. Impacts on crops and livestock. We did have a chance to speak with some operators, but very limited. We ended up with a total of 4 operators speaking with us. And these tended to be those who are on the very positive side of things. And so we had some fantastic, like actual exemplary operators who do connect with their communities, who are very concerned with the people that they're working with and beside. And so we're seeing from them, number one is the fact that they're actually not receiving a lot of direct complaints about impacts on crops and livestock. That tends to come not from the farmers, but from the residents. And so there seems to be a mixed message. And that's something that needs to be addressed as well. They do focus on rehabilitation. They do, the ones we spoke with, try and have a lot of effective communication. Another significant issue is a lot of people really don't understand aggregate. And that's a really big issue for the aggregate companies, because that's what creates a lot of the problems. They are aware of traffic and try to deal with it. One of the issues being that a lot of the traffic is independent operators rather than the aggregate operators themselves. So I'll just run quickly through the output. We do have most of the reports are published or will be published on Wayne's website. We're producing toolkits that are very similar to those that have been produced for a lot of the other projects. Most especially, what we are focusing on here is a set of BMPs for aggregate operators. The two major toolkits that we're putting out are for aggregate operators and for the municipalities. What we're trying to do is to provide some very actionable BMPs that are focused directly on a lot of the issues that are being raised, that provide a very strong justification for the reasons behind why these BMPs should be adopted. And then, of course, some very concrete ways that they can be put into action. So most especially, know your agricultural neighbors. Just like aggregate companies complain that farmers don't understand aggregate, aggregate needs to understand agriculture, because, well, we all know that agriculture is very widely varied and has a lot of very different needs depending on what you're doing. Practice community outreach, go above and beyond. In other words, don't just do the bare minimum. Develop a communication strategy. Manage traffic with agriculture in mind. Okay? Very importantly, we need to understand that agriculture has important needs. It's big. At the same time, it has very particular times. Invest in the economy, local economy, embrace progressive rehabilitation, very key. That demonstrates commitment, and establish a business-to-business relationship with neighboring farms. Okay, I think I'll just kind of pull back on that because I have 2 minutes left for questions. But at the same time, one of the things that I think that we've really come to understand is that aggregates and agriculture are very compatible industries. They can work together quite well, and especially from the farmers' interviews, it has more to do with how the company is managed than the industry itself. And so by looking at these BMPs and making use of them, there's a very strong potential for managing the relationship between the two. I'll stop there and say thank you to all of you for your patience and to all of the assistance we've received to this point.